When the black CEO stepped into the first-class cabin, the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. The air that had moments earlier been filled with the quiet rustle of newspapers and the faint clinking of glasses suddenly grew heavy with judgmental stares. He carried himself with calm authority, his tailored suit a silent testament to years of hard work, perseverance, and success. But instead of being welcomed as just another passenger who had rightfully earned his place, he became the target of ridicule. A small group of passengers, seated nearby, exchanged smirks as if they had spotted something out of place. Their eyes followed him as he adjusted his bag into the overhead compartment, their whispers just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to feign innocence if confronted. Soon, the snickers turned into open laughter, a mocking chorus that spread across the row like wildfire. The CEO, though accustomed to challenges in boardrooms and negotiations, had not expected this kind of treatment in a space where success should have been the equalizer. He knew what those laughs meant. They weren't about his choice of clothing, his demeanor, or his actions. They were rooted in something far deeper, something uglier, the disbelief that a black man could sit in first class without it being a mistake. Some of the passengers leaned back in their seats, whispering comments laced with sarcasm, their eyes glinting with the cruelty of people who believed themselves superior. Others chuckled without even hiding their disdain, as though his very presence was a kind of comedy routine staged for their amusement. It wasn't just laughter, it was the language of exclusion. It carried the weight of centuries of prejudice, disguised as casual humor. Every chuckle was a reminder of the stereotypes that still lingered in the minds of many, stereotypes that questioned his worthiness of being there. The CEO sat down, his posture straight, his face expressionless, while the sound of their mockery echoed around him. The noise wasn't deafening, but its meaning was loud enough to cut deep. He was aware of the eyes on him, some filled with pity, others with quiet agreement, as if they too questioned how he had managed to belong in that space. The cruelty of laughter in such a setting is that it strips away dignity in the most subtle yet powerful way. Unlike outright insults, it thrives on implication. The passengers didn't need to shout slurs, their laughter said everything. It suggested that his presence was laughable, that he was an imposter in a seat reserved for someone else. For them, his suit was not a mark of professionalism but a costume that didn't quite fit. Each chuckle was a verdict, a declaration that he was out of place. In that cabin, designed for comfort and exclusivity, the sharp edge of racism pierced through the polished service and elegant decor. The CEO felt the weight of history pressing on him in that moment. Generations of men and women who had been denied entry to places of privilege and power, who had been laughed at, doubted, or excluded, seemed to sit with him. The mocking voices were not new, they were echoes of boardrooms where he had been underestimated, of deals where he had been dismissed before he spoke, of rooms where he had been the only black face and had to prove himself twice over. This was another arena, but the game was the same, a constant battle against perception. Laughter, in this case, wasn't innocent amusement, it was a weapon. It was meant to diminish, to remind him of invisible boundaries that some believed still existed. It was an attempt to reduce his achievements to nothing more than a punchline. The passengers who laughed felt emboldened, confident that their behavior would go unchecked, that their mockery would dissolve into the hum of the flight and be forgotten. But for the CEO, every laugh was a stone thrown against the wall of respect he had built over years. It chipped at the quiet dignity he carried with him, forcing him to confront yet again the reality that success does not shield one from prejudice. He didn't rise to confront them. He didn't return their laughter with anger or embarrassment. Instead, he sat in silence, his eyes steady, his demeanor calm. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the sting of their derision lingered. He was no stranger to challenges, but each incident like this left a mark, a reminder of how quickly accomplishment could be dismissed in the face of ignorance. While others in the cabin sipped champagne and scrolled through screens, he endured the chorus of laughter that refused to see him as he truly was, a leader, an achiever, a man who had earned his seat. ChatGPT said, the CEO's silence was not weakness, nor was it surrender. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply powerful. As the laughter around him continued, he chose stillness over reaction. His hands rested calmly on the armrests of the leather seat, his gaze fixed ahead, and his expression unreadable. There was no twitch of anger, no defensive movement, no sign that their mockery had broken through his composure. For many in that cabin, silence might have appeared as passivity, but in reality, it was the language of strength. He had long understood that sometimes the most profound statement comes not from what you say, but from what you refuse to give voice to. The passengers who mocked him expected a reaction. They wanted him to flinch, to look away, to shrink into himself. They anticipated anger, maybe even confrontation, so they could twist it into a stereotype, using his justified response as evidence for their prejudice. Yet, when faced with their sneers and laughter, he denied them that satisfaction. Instead, his silence disarmed them in ways words never could. His calm demeanor made their laughter seem small, petty, and desperate, while his stillness radiated a quiet authority that no mockery could touch. Years of navigating boardrooms where every word he spoke was scrutinized had taught him the value of restraint. As a black man in positions of power, he had often been forced to walk a tightrope between being assertive and being perceived as aggressive. He knew that the wrong tone, the wrong word, or the wrong look could overshadow his achievements and redefine him in the eyes of others. In those moments, silence had often been his shield, and once again, it served him now. But this was not the silence of submission, it was the silence of discipline, of a man who knew the power of letting others expose their own ignorance without his assistance. The laughter began to taper off, not because the passengers had found kindness, but because they were unsettled by his lack of response. There is a kind of discomfort that comes when cruelty fails to produce its intended result. Their mockery was a weapon designed to wound, but when it hit a wall of calm indifference, the weapon turned inward, making them question the point of their cruelty. The CEO's silence left them hanging, their laughter echoing awkwardly in the otherwise quiet cabin, until it seemed to embarrass them more than it hurt him. His silence also created space, space for observation, space for reflection, and space for control. In silence, he could measure the room, take note of who joined in the laughter, who looked away in discomfort, and who watched with quiet curiosity. He could sense the shifting energy, the passengers who were suddenly unsure whether their behavior was as harmless as they pretended it to be. Silence gave him the ability to remain in command of himself, while they lost control of the image they projected. In that stillness, he was not diminished. He was elevated. What many failed to realize was that silence itself is a form of communication. It speaks volumes without uttering a single word. In this case, it communicated dignity, resilience, and unshakable self-respect. It said, "Your opinion does not define me. Your laughter does not touch me. I am more than what you see." For the CEO, silence became a mirror that reflected back the smallness of those who mocked him. While they attempted to reduce him with their words, his composure revealed their own lack of character, their inability to rise above prejudice. There were passengers in the cabin who noticed. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the laughing men and the CEO's stillness. A man 2 rows ahead stole quick looks back, his expression suggesting unease at the behavior he witnessed. The crew members, too, were caught in the tension, their trained smiles wavering as they pretended not to hear the snickering but silently acknowledged the wrongness of it all. His silence did more than protect his own dignity, it highlighted the cruelty of others for everyone present to see. Silence, in that moment, was not about ignoring the insult. It was about elevating above it. It was about choosing not to descend into the level of those who sought to belittle him. It was about preserving his energy for battles that mattered, while letting the ugliness of prejudice collapse under its own weight. His calmness did not erase the sting of the laughter, but it transformed the narrative. Instead of being seen as a victim of ridicule, he became the man who, without a word, made their cruelty look small and hollow. The CEO sat there in his seat, still and composed, letting the silence work its way through the cabin. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he was fully aware of the eyes on him and the echoes of laughter still lingering in the air. He knew that silence could send a message, but he also understood the weight of timing, and when to act decisively. After a few minutes, without a trace of hesitation, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his sleek phone. His movements were deliberate, calm, as though he were about to handle an everyday task. But to those watching, it was clear that something was about to shift. The same passengers who had mocked him earlier leaned back, curious now, unsure of what he was doing. What they did not realize was that this simple act, making one phone call, would unravel their assumptions entirely. He scrolled through his contacts with the ease of someone who had the world at his fingertips, not flaunting, not rushing, simply purposeful. Then, with a subtle press of his finger, he placed the call. His voice, low and composed, carried enough authority to command attention even without effort. He wasn't loud, he wasn't boastful, but the calm confidence with which he spoke was unmistakable. The call was not to a friend, not to a family member, but to someone whose influence reached far beyond the walls of that cabin. As he introduced himself, those within earshot picked up fragments of the conversation, words like flight, protocol, and situation. It was clear to anyone listening that this was no casual chat. What unsettled the mocking passengers was not just the call itself, but the way he carried it. He spoke like a man used to decisions that affected thousands, like someone who was familiar with commanding respect across boardrooms and international stages. His tone was measured, authoritative, but calm. Every word was intentional, every pause heavy with unspoken meaning. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, his composure spoke volumes. The passengers who had laughed so freely moments ago now shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, realizing that this was not a man who would fade quietly into their ridicule. It was not long before the tone of the cabin changed. A flight attendant, who had been hesitant before, approached with newfound attentiveness, her voice softer, her smile more cautious. She checked in on him, offering small courtesies that hadn't been extended earlier. The call had already begun to ripple outward, shifting the dynamics of the situation. The very presence of that phone call created a kind of invisible pressure, reminding everyone that they weren't just mocking a fellow passenger, they had underestimated someone whose reach and influence extended far beyond their assumptions. The CEO didn't make the call to show off or to boast. He wasn't interested in proving his worth to those who doubted it. He made the call because he had the power to, because he knew the weight of his voice, and because he understood that sometimes one strategic move is more powerful than 100 arguments. That phone call represented years of work, of building networks, of earning respect through results. It was the culmination of a journey in which every barrier broken had given him the ability to command action with a single request. For the passengers who laughed, the realization came slowly but heavily. They began to piece together that this man wasn't just sitting in first class because of chance or luck. He belonged there, perhaps more than anyone else on the flight. Their laughter now seemed foolish in contrast to the gravity of the moment. They had tried to strip him of dignity with their mockery, but the authority in his voice during that call gave it all back tenfold. Each word he spoke reminded them of the reality they had tried to deny, that power, success, and influence do not come wrapped in a single color or face. The cabin grew quieter as the call continued. Even those who hadn't joined in the laughter listened with interest, their respect for him quietly growing. It wasn't about the details of what was said, it was about the way he said it, the unshakable calm of someone who had nothing to prove yet still commanded the room. In that moment, the passengers realized they were not looking at someone out of place in first class. They were looking at someone whose life was defined by being in places that others said he couldn't be, and thriving there regardless. ChatGPT said, the moment the phone call ended, a subtle shift spread through the cabin, but it became most evident in the behavior of the crew. Flight attendants, who had previously walked past his row with polite but detached professionalism, suddenly carried themselves with a heightened sense of awareness. Their eyes lingered longer, their steps slowed near his seat, and their smiles, once routine, now bore a careful sincerity. It was as though a quiet alarm had been triggered, compelling them to reassess not just their duties but the very way they treated the man who sat calmly in first class. The lead attendant approached first, her demeanor noticeably different from earlier interactions. She leaned down slightly, her voice lowered in a tone that carried both courtesy and caution. There was a certain unease in her movements, as if she had realized that the balance of power in the cabin was not what she had assumed when the passengers' laughter began. She offered refreshments with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the dismissive air from before. Her eyes avoided direct acknowledgement of what had happened, but her sudden attentiveness was itself an acknowledgement that the situation had changed, that the man they had underestimated was not one to be brushed aside. Another crew member appeared moments later, adjusting pillows, offering additional comfort items, ensuring that his needs were met before others. Their sudden eagerness to serve was not born solely from duty, it was tinged with the awareness that the passenger before them commanded respect well beyond the confines of that aircraft. The subtle edge in their actions betrayed the knowledge that whatever connections he had reached with that one phone call carried weight, and that ignoring him was no longer an option. The shift was not lost on the surrounding passengers. Those who had laughed earlier exchanged uneasy glances, watching the crew's behavior with growing discomfort. They noticed the difference, the way the attendants now leaned in attentively, the careful precision with which they delivered service to his row. What had once been a stage for their mockery was transforming into a quiet stage of reverence, one where the CEO's composure and influence had forced the cabin into realignment. The very people who had chuckled at his presence now witnessed flight attendants treating him with the kind of deference reserved for the most distinguished passengers. But beyond the surface-level change in service, there was something deeper in the crew's reaction. Their sudden attentiveness revealed the unspoken truth about hierarchy and perception. At first, they had allowed the laughter to unfold unchecked, perhaps uncertain about intervening, perhaps quietly complicit in the assumption that he was an outsider in that space. Yet now, after witnessing his calm silence followed by the weight of a single phone call, their posture had shifted entirely. The power dynamic in the cabin had flipped, and their actions became a quiet apology, a nonverbal attempt to distance themselves from the passenger's cruelty. One attendant lingered longer than necessary, asking if he needed assistance with his seat or additional comfort. Her words were framed with a politeness that seemed to stretch beyond procedure, as if to compensate for the earlier indifference. The CEO's response was simple, polite, and restrained, but that was enough to deepen the impact of the moment. His calm dignity made their sudden deference even more pronounced, exposing the contrast between how he had been perceived minutes earlier and how he was being treated now. There was also a visible tension among the crew members themselves. They exchanged glances in the galley, whispering in hushed tones while casting quick looks toward his seat. It was as though they were recalibrating their understanding of the situation, struggling to reconcile the laughter they had allowed to echo unchecked with the reality of who he truly was. Their gestures of service became more precise, their tone softer, their presence more constant. Even the smallest actions, refilling a glass of water, straightening a blanket, were performed with an extra layer of care. For the CEO, the sudden change was familiar. He had lived through countless situations where respect arrived late, only after his achievements, his title, or his influence became undeniable. He recognized the shift for what it was, not genuine recognition of his humanity, but a reaction to the authority they had just glimpsed. Yet he met their newfound attentiveness with the same composure he had shown from the beginning. He neither demanded it nor rejected it, he simply allowed their actions to speak louder than words ever could. The rest of the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The mocking passengers, who had once treated him as the object of their ridicule, were now witnesses to the way the crew treated him with heightened courtesy. Their laughter seemed like a distant echo, replaced by the weight of recognition that they had misjudged him. The crew's reaction had turned into a mirror, reflecting back the pettiness of their mockery and highlighting the dignity of the man they had underestimated. The silence that had settled over the cabin after the phone call and the crew's sudden attentiveness began to work its way into the minds of the passengers. Those who had been so quick to laugh, to mock, and to whisper among themselves now found themselves fidgeting in their seats, adjusting their posture, or pretending to focus on the screens in front of them. Their earlier boldness seemed to evaporate, replaced by a quiet tension that spoke louder than their ridicule ever had. The shift in energy was undeniable. The man they had once dismissed as out of place was now being treated with a level of deference that unsettled their assumptions, and they were forced to reconcile what they had seen with the reality unfolding before them. Some passengers, the ones who had laughed the loudest, now avoided eye contact altogether. They busied themselves with magazines or tapped nervously on their phones, desperate to appear occupied. Their earlier confidence had relied on the shared mockery of the group, but with the crew's behavior transformed, that safety net had vanished. Their laughter no longer echoed in camaraderie, it lingered awkwardly in memory, exposing their cruelty. The absence of support made them shrink into silence, unwilling to risk another look in his direction. Others, who had not joined in the laughter but had allowed it to unfold without protest, began to look at him differently. Their expressions carried a quiet mixture of guilt and respect. They had witnessed his composure, his calm, and the dignified way he handled the situation without a single outburst. In their silence, they acknowledged the difference between the passengers who mocked and the man who had risen above it. Their glances were tentative, as though hoping to convey some unspoken recognition, a subtle admission that they saw him now in a light they should have seen from the beginning. A few brave ones shifted even further. They adjusted their tone when speaking to the crew, lowering their voices, softening their words, careful not to mirror the dismissive behavior that had filled the cabin earlier. One man, seated across the aisle, leaned back in his chair and studied the CEO for a moment longer than most. There was no malice in his gaze now, only curiosity, perhaps even admiration. It was as though he was silently re-evaluating the assumptions he had made at first sight, realizing the foolishness of judging someone by appearance rather than presence. The laughter that once united a handful of passengers had turned into an invisible weight pressing down on them. They were no longer laughing, they were calculating, reassessing, and quietly regretting. The CEO's single act of composure followed by the phone call had stripped their ridicule of power. What remained was the uncomfortable truth that they had revealed more about themselves than about him. Each passenger who had laughed was left to grapple with that truth in their own way, some with shame, others with an uneasy sense of respect. The atmosphere in the cabin transformed into something almost reverent. Conversations that followed were subdued, careful, and fragmented. Passengers lowered their voices as though not to disturb the quiet dignity radiating from his seat. A woman seated diagonally from him leaned toward her companion, whispering in tones that carried more curiosity than contempt, her eyes flickering back toward him with the kind of guarded awe reserved for someone who had commanded a room without effort. Even those who had not engaged with him directly could not escape the shift in perception. His silence, his calm, and his authority had forced them to confront their own biases, leaving them unsettled but changed. The very passengers who had once thought of him as undeserving of first class now found themselves reconsidering what it meant to deserve such a place. They began to see the suit not as a costume but as a reflection of his stature. They saw the composure not as aloofness but as strength. The phone call became, in their minds, a symbol of influence, of networks and authority that extended far beyond their understanding. Each glance in his direction was tinged with a new recognition, that he was not only equal to the space he occupied but perhaps greater than it. The change in attitude was not born out of kindness or sudden enlightenment alone. It was born out of being confronted with undeniable evidence that their prejudices had been wrong. They had judged him quickly, harshly, unfairly, and now they were being forced to reconcile with the truth. Their respect may not have been immediate or pure, but it was real enough to alter their behavior. They had underestimated him, and in doing so, they had diminished themselves. Now, with every look and every careful action, they sought to recover some measure of dignity, though the contrast between their earlier laughter and their current restraint made it clear that the balance had already shifted. What lingered most after the laughter faded, after the silence spoke louder than words, after the phone call shifted the air, and after the crew and passengers recalibrated their behavior, was the undeniable presence of dignity. The CEO had not needed to argue, to raise his voice, or to retaliate in order to reclaim his worth in that space. His composure alone had carried the weight of centuries of struggle, of breaking barriers, of standing firm in the face of prejudice. He represented the quiet strength of those who had endured, those who had refused to let mockery define them. Every movement, every pause, every measured breath became a reminder that true respect is not demanded with aggression but earned through unshakable self-control. The dignity he carried was not performative. It was not about proving himself to the strangers around him. It was about honoring himself, his journey, and the sacrifices that had brought him to that seat. In choosing not to stoop to the level of the passengers who mocked him, he held on to a deeper truth, that respect begins within, long before it is reflected outward. By refusing to let their cruelty disturb his composure, he drew a line in the sand, one that made clear that their laughter could not touch his identity or his worth. That kind of dignity is rare, and it commands attention even from those who once doubted it. For the other passengers, the message unfolded slowly but powerfully. They began to see what dignity looks like when it is tested. They witnessed how a man could be subjected to ridicule yet respond with restraint, how he could be mocked yet remain unshaken, how he could be underestimated yet reveal his strength without a word of confrontation. It forced them to question their own behavior, their own prejudices, their own silent complicity. Respect was no longer just an abstract concept, it was something they could feel pressing on them in the quiet of that cabin, in the contrast between who they had been when they laughed and who they became once they understood. The respect he inspired was not born from fear or intimidation, but from realization. It came from the way he held himself, the way he carried a history of resilience without needing to announce it. It came from the simple truth that dignity disarms cruelty in ways that anger cannot. His silence and calm did not erase the insult, but they transformed the narrative. He was no longer the object of ridicule, he was the mirror reflecting back the smallness of those who mocked him, and in that reflection, they saw themselves differently. What gave the moment even more power was that his dignity extended beyond himself. It became symbolic, a reminder to everyone in that cabin that prejudice is not only ugly but futile. No amount of laughter could erase the fact that he had earned his place in first class. No whispered insult could undo the decades of perseverance, intelligence, and determination that had carried him there. His presence alone challenged the invisible barriers that some still tried to uphold, and his response showed that the greatest victories often come without a raised fist or a shouted word. For those who watched closely, it was impossible not to be moved. They saw how respect was reclaimed not by demanding it, but by embodying it. They saw how a man could remind the world of his worth not through confrontation, but through unwavering self-respect. In that cabin, the message was written into the silence, into the shift in the crew's behavior, into the uneasy glances of passengers who had once laughed. It was written into the atmosphere itself, reminding everyone that dignity is the most powerful response to disrespect. Even as the plane cruised steadily through the skies, the lesson hung in the air. Respect, once denied, had been reclaimed, not through force, but through presence. The CEO had reminded everyone, without a single outburst, that true strength is measured not in the ability to strike back, but in the ability to stand tall, unshaken, and unmoved in the face of ridicule. His calm became a statement, his silence a lesson, his very existence in that seat an unspoken declaration that no amount of laughter, prejudice, or ignorance could take away the dignity he carried within him.